Over the past 3 years I have played through all the modern Atelier games, and even though I've given my thoughts on them in separate videos, I think it would be a cool idea to just rank them in one place too. I want to make it clear before we even start though that I consider all the games here to at least be good. I finished all of them and I don't complete games that I don't enjoy, so don't expect to see anything here that I outright hated. Secondly, when I say modern Atelier games, I mean any game from the PS3 onwards, which is when Gust reverted back to the unique crafting focus of Atelier as a franchise. I will not be including the remake of Atelier Marie, as that's just a re-release of an older title. Side games like Nelk won't be here, and despite being advertised as such, I will not include the Gacha entry either because I don't consider that to be a mainline game. Take it up with my lawyer. Even still, that leaves us with 14 games to rank, so we've got a lot to cover. Without further ado, let's get rolling with number 14. And the entry at the bottom of the list will be Atelier Shally, the final Dusk game. For all intents, this should have been my favourite of the trilogy because it was the only Dusk entry that didn't have a time limit, but Shally just felt like it never fully embraced that. When I think of any game with no time constraints, I think of freedom of choice and playing the game at my own pace. But Shally doesn't really allow that, instead it substitutes the time mechanic for something called life tasks, which are these arbitrary missions that in some cases you must do to advance the plot. And when you complete them, the game effectively locks you out of doing much else until you move on to the next chapter. I'm not a fan of the life tasks, and I'm glad that they've been mostly abandoned in later entries. I think the protagonists themselves don't really play off each other too well. Shalistera and Charlotte feel like over-exaggerated caricatures of a shy and peppy girl that don't mix as well as other duos, and the game as a whole starts off very slow. Combat, alchemy, story, exploration, it's all very much on rails for a period of time before it gets going. It has highlights no doubt, especially on the story front regarding the Dusk Sea, and I think the game has the best opening of all the Atelier games, so that's a feather in its cap, but overall, Shally is the weakest game of the series I have played to date. At number 13 will be, in release order, the second mysterious title, Atelier Firis. This is a tough one for me because I really like the character of Firis. She's easily my favourite protag of the Mysterious sub-series, it's just a shame she was put in this game. Firis embraced the idea of large open worlds to explore. The actual areas are split into zones, but the landmass of those zones is absolutely huge compared to many contemporaries, especially in that period. Even so, it does make sense. This is a game subtitled as The Mysterious Journey, so it makes sense the world opens up for a game about a journey. Firis is all about making your way to the capital of Reisenberg to complete the Alchemist's exam. You have a year to make it there. So it has a time limit, and it is the only one of the Mysterious games to have it, which I feel is counterintuitive to the design of Firis the game. This entry is all about exploration, going off the beaten path to find secrets and the like. Activities that naturally use up time, so having a time limit looming just doesn't make sense to me, even with how lenient it is. Saying that, once you complete the exam, the time limit disappears, giving you freedom to engage in the post-game offerings. And you've still got a lot to do afterwards. You've effectively only seen a third of the game when the credits roll, which is bonkers, so thumbs up for that. But no, the real issue of Firis is all in its alchemy, or should I say, two specific mechanics. To even get recipes in this game, you have to find hints within the world. Once you engage with that hint enough, you eventually unlock the means by which you can make the item. The issue is that you have no idea what you have to do to get the hint in the first place. It is a completionist's nightmare. And in addition, I swear that it just doesn't work at times. There are a couple of items that I know I did everything for, but they never appeared on my list. But that's not even the biggest problem. That is reserved for the proficiency grinding. Since Firis is a rookie alchemist, especially at the start of her journey, it stands to reason that she blows, and she's got to get better at it. Gust took that premise very literally. When Firis completes an item for the first time, it sucks because you're not able to pass on traits or make larger quantities. To gain the ability to make better versions of these items, Firis has to repeat a synthesis a lot, and slowly but surely her proficiency at making the item will go up. For items you're making frequently, this isn't too much of a problem, but for late game equipment that use uncommon or even rare materials for instance, you need to make several duds before you get a crack at the best version, and that's just a waste of time. Theorist was a case of a game that had a lot of good ideas on paper, but they weren't executed as well as they could have been. Plus, mass synthesis sucks, and I'm glad it hasn't been included in any other game. Now I have a feeling number 12 might upset a few people, but for me, this one didn't hook me in as much as I was hoping. It's the final Ireland game in Atelier Lelua. Once again, love Lelua herself. She may not be my favourite protag of the Ireland games, but she's certainly in that higher bracket for how off the wall she can be. She's a right clown, this one. I also think that Lelua acts as a great epilogue to the sub-series. You see a lot of returning characters, there's a notable time skip as well, so you can see the tangible changes in the cast, and it is a cosy game, there is no denying that. The fact that it's the only Ireland game that doesn't use a time limit is one factor that works in its favour, at least for me. I like the combat in this game overall. The use of 5 members at once, 3 on the front and 2 on the back, was a nice change of pace to the previous 3 games, and it's got a fair amount of challenge to it for some of the bosses, especially in the later stages. This challenge is only amplified if you're not keeping up with your alchemy, and this is where I feel Lelua drops the ball. No doubt it has a lot of quality of life features like wholesaling items to make the experience easier, but the core of the system is a bit overtuned. Alchemy systems in Atelier have to strike a fine balance where they need ease of access but also the depth to them to allow them to stand out from their contemporaries. In the same breath though, they have to provide mechanics that don't wrestle with one another. There has to be a sense that the system is not working against you too heavily. There is no doubt that Lelua's alchemy system has depth, but it has so much in it that it starts to become frustrating to work with. The big proponents of this were the awakened effects, as getting the most out of Lelua's system requires a good understanding of not only the traits and effect levels, but also the awakened effects too. Finding the combinations that work in line with this while also still balancing the staples like effect level and combining traits turns it into an involved system, but maybe a little too involved for my tastes. It's no doubt the most complex alchemy system I've seen yet, and I've got nothing against that. In fact, I have respect for Gus trying something like this, but I think they tipped the needle a little bit too far. Even so, Lelua is a great game and a solid entry to Ireland in of itself. And if Atelier Lelua had people shouting at their screens, I'm certain the next entry will do the same. Number 11, and falling just outside the top 10 for me, is Atelier Ryza 3. It is a great game, of course it is. It was on my top 10 list of JRPGs for 2023, there's no doubt I had a memorable time with the final Ryza game, and again I reiterate this, every game on this list, even the ones at the bottom, are at least a 7 out of 10 experience for me. There is no game here that I outright despise. But I know there will be some who will draw that conclusion, so I'm going to remind you here. If I see that comment, then you're a donut, a custard-filled one too, because no one likes those. So why does the third Ryza game end up here? Well, for me, it left itself with too much to do, while also feeling too similar to its predecessor. Its similarity isn't necessarily a bad thing because said predecessor was really good, so there wasn't much to improve on, but I couldn't help feeling I was playing the same game. Ryza 3 did bring in the keys, which were a cool addition to the makeup of the trilogy, but otherwise it was mostly the same. Still, for me, Ryza 3 is mostly held back by how bloated it felt. I stand by my opinion that this game could have easily ended 5 to 10 hours earlier. A lot of the story in the final third of the game was a meandering affair with very little progress made, and I'd say the cause for that was due to the new characters, which I believe never needed to exist in the first place. Ryza 3 was all about the journey coming full circle for her and her friends. It was never about exploring the stories of new cast members. If this game stuck to Ryza, Claudia, Tal, Bose and Lentz, then not only do I feel this game would have naturally become shorter, but it also would have more impact and flow, because it would have focused on characters that we actually knew and cared about. With all due respect to the new entries, I didn't really care for what they brought to the table, because for all intents the story of Ryza was centred around that core cast. This problem was only highlighted further when considering the alchemy, which was very easy to break. 10 hours in, and I had everything I needed to finish the game, so my time with the alchemy was much lower than in previous entries, and was therefore more focused on the story itself, so that length became more of a problem as I started to be exposed to it even more. I do have a lot of time for the third Riser game, but it's undoubtedly my least favourite of the trilogy. We're into the top 10 now, and I think this spot is pretty much reserved for Atelier Rorona, the first Ireland game, and a good entry point for anyone interested in the series as a whole. In this game, an apprentice alchemist, Rorona, works with her seemingly lazy master Astrid in an atelier that doesn't get too much custom. Eventually, an edict comes from the king to close the atelier for good in light of its lacking patronage. Rorona is left to complete the assignments every 3 months for 3 years to allow it to continue operating. And that is the story in a nutshell. Short, simple and sweet, which is par for the course for many of the earlier Atelier games. Rorona is just a by the numbers experience all said and done. It sports all of the elements that a modern Atelier game requires, like a good alchemy system, enjoyable character arcs, and a simple yet addicting gameplay loop in regards to exploration and turn-based combat. In short, there was nothing that the game really excelled in, but at the same time there was nothing I look at as an outright detriment to it as well. It just does its thing, and is wholly inoffensive while doing it. I could probably argue that the time limit is a bit harsh if you want the more involved endings, of which there are 14 in total, and some of the requirements for them are whack, but I don't really care much for that facet of these games. What ending I get is all good with me, and I'll just watch the others elsewhere. Nah, this one's good. And that commentary will remain mostly the same for number 9, which will be the first mysterious game in Atelier Sophie. The only real difference between this and Rorona is that it doesn't have a time limit. You're free to do things when you want. When omitting that though, the makeup of Sophie is very similar to Rorona. You operate out of a central hub that is your atelier, you do requests, attempt to make items to help Placta, who is a book for much of this game to regain her memories, and that's about it. The story focus is once again quite scarce here, and more import is put on the exploration, alchemy and characters. It may be a bit dated for some, but as an Atelier experience it ticks a lot of boxes. The biggest issue I had with the game came in something that was more specific to me anyway. The grid-based alchemy system is dependent on colours to separate the elements. There are no symbols that do that. And for me, that's a detriment because I am partially colourblind and as such had to find third-party applications that could circumvent that. Not necessarily the game's fault, but if it has something in there that prevents me from getting properly stuck in, then I have to dock it points. Otherwise though, another solid entry point. And we're sticking with entry point titles with number 8, which will be the first Dusk game, Atelier Ayesha. Now unlike the 2 previous entries, Ayesha is actually quite different in how it goes about the journey. We're made aware that Ayesha's sister Neo was spirited away in the past and that Ayesha visits her grave in the nearby ruins daily. On this specific day though, the flowers around her grave glow and show an image of Neo, suggesting she is still alive. Ayesha is told that the secret to finding her sister lies with researching alchemy and learning the secrets of the flowers surrounding her grave. Ayesha is effectively going on a journey of discovery, following clues and events to eventually find the means by which she can rescue her sister within a 3-year period. But despite having that time limit, it's very lenient. For instance, I completed the main goal of this game halfway through the 2nd year, and it was one of the only ones I got the true ending for with relative ease. Ayesha is also pretty good in every other area. Exploration is decent, as is the turn-based combat, which places more importance on positioning of members, and the alchemy system is no doubt a joy, when you understand it at least. My real issue with Ayesha is despite how good that alchemy is, it's not explained as well as it should be. There are a lot of things to work with in Ayesha's alchemy system, and even by the end I didn't understand all of it. My gauge to determine if a game has explained its mechanics well enough is whether I feel the need to use guides outside of the game, and for Ayesha I did on quite a few occasions. Once I got it, awesome, and I have to dock it points there. The other areas of the game though are fine, and just like Rorona and Sophie, it doesn't do anything outright offensive to take away from the experience. At number 7, we're going to be rounding out the introductory entries with the first Ryza game, which for me is the best introduction to Atelier if you're starting with the first game of a sub-series. And I say that because I speak from experience. This is the game that brought me into Atelier and has made me a lifelong fan. There might be a bit of bias as a result of this, but this is my list. Of course there's going to be bias, I'd like to think that goes without saying. There is no doubt I have a soft spot for Atelier Ryza, even with its shortcomings. I will admit that I didn't latch onto it for about the first 5 hours or so, but as the experience deepened, I became more enthralled with it, especially when I started to grasp the idea of crafting. Up to this point, I had never played a game that placed as much importance on the crafting of equipment, so Ryza was a game that went against the grain, and maybe that's one reason why it stood out to me. But even so, I'd still say it was the best entry point for me even looking back. It's still a very nice looking game to this day, brilliant OST, as is the case with most Atelier games. I quite like the combat with the ATB approach, and of course the alchemy and exploration were the definition of relaxation and chill vibes, even if the alchemy system itself is admittedly more simple than contemporaries. It had some aspects in there that were a bit annoying, like its oddly paced story, and I do think this is the weakest representation of the OG cast we see in the later games, but I think that's to be expected. We need a foundation to build on, so it does that well enough. Overall, Ryza 1 was a great first impression of Atelier, and I owe it a lot for bringing me into this series all those years ago. Up to number 6 now, and this is where my personal ratings of the games jumps quite a bit. Pretty much every entry from this point is at least an 8.5 out of 10 for me if we're applying a numerical measure, so splitting them apart was quite difficult. But falling just outside the top 5 will be Atelier Melody, the third Ireland game. Melody is the princess of the kingdom of Arles who is being taught alchemy. She wants to use alchemy as a method of helping her kingdom, and the game is based around developing the land and growing the population so that Arles can grow into a mini metropolis before joining with the Republic of Ireland. To do this, Mel will fulfill certain tasks given to her over a fairly lenient time frame of 5 years. And it's that civilization-like mechanic that puts Melody in a unique position of its own. It's really cool to develop the land on the outskirts of the kingdom to better the lives of the citizens. It actually gives a real sense of purpose to Melody's desire to learn alchemy, so as a narrative focus it's definitely got that part down, even if it is quite low-key. Much of the other aspects are similar to its two predecessors like alchemy, exploration and combat, but there's no doubt to me that this entry has the best OST of all the Atelier games if I'm considering the songs as a collective. I just really dig the angle they went with the music in this one. Very cool. Love the returning cast members too. They played on a lot of those in-jokes to build on them here, and it definitely works in the game's favour. Melody's just a great game all said and done, not to mention I was a big fan of the protagonist herself. Again, not my favourite, but definitely up there. This was a solid way to end the original Ireland trilogy. Into the top 5 now, and number 5 goes to the third mysterious game, Atelier Lydian Sewell. What a joy of a game this was, a brilliant way to end the original Mysterious trilogy. It just took all of the great things of Sophie, removed the annoyances of Firis, and built on that to make itself the stand-out experience of that trilogy. Lydian Sewell are two twins that run an atelier in the town of Mervale with their father, and their desire is to be the best in the city. They do this by fulfilling tasks given to them by the internal government, and are ranked based on their performance. Simple premise, as is the case in many games, but it works. And even saying that, I do think Lydian Sewell has the best narrative of the first 3 Mysterious games. Lydian Sewell's story is notably family focused, leading to a more relatable journey as they attempt to become the best atelier in the city. Though in a bubble it's not the deepest story you're ever going to see, it does have some shining moments that took me aback. I also think it plays on the continuity of the sub-series very well. You're going to see plenty of returning faces here. That's not to say that the new entries are lacking. Liddy and Suelle in particular are a memorable duo in of themselves with solid chemistry. Also, I don't think I need to say that Atelier games aren't the best in the graphics department, but I love the diversity in these zones, illustrated mostly by the painted worlds. As the name of the game suggests, these mysterious paintings act as the new areas where Liddy and Suelle can explore, with the potential of finding items that can't be found in the real world. It's pretty clear that the art team was just told to go wild and come up with whatever they could think of, and it results in some eye-catching zones. But the real highlight of this game is undoubtedly the alchemy system. It is not only the best iteration for the Mysterious games, but it's also one of my top 2 for the entire franchise, an almost perfect mix of easy to use but difficult to master. All the mechanics are introduced in good time, they play off each other and build on one another. It's just brilliant all the way through. I adore Liddy and Suelle, it's a joy of a game and does many things that I love in this series. It may be a bit difficult to get the true ending, but that's whatever I guess. Fantastic entry. Falling just outside the top 4 spot is going to be the final Ireland game at Atelier Totori, which surprises me more than anything else. I knew before going into Totori that it had a tight time constraint, and that was no joke. It remains the hardest Atelier game I have played purely because of that, so much so that I had to restart the game twice. I have not had to do that for any other game in the franchise, so yes, it did frustrate me at times. But once I got past that, once I really got into the meat of what Totori was, I found a game that was by far and away my favourite of the Ireland sub-series. It was the perfect mix of exploration, combat and alchemy, and it just got better and better as the hours passed. The OST was great too, as always. In this game, Totori must show she is worthy of being an adventurer, or her license will be revoked. By earning license points and returning to Ireland, she is able to rank up periodically, and this allows her to go to ever more dangerous areas as she gains experience. If she is able to meet these requirements, the game eventually stretches to 6 years come the end. It's this progression that allows Totori to stand out. The world is just huge in this game, and when you think you've seen it all, you get another zone, then another, then another. It just never stops hitting you with new stuff. And it really does feel like you're on an adventure as you work to find Totori's mother, which is the main goal of the game and why Totori becomes an adventurer in the first place. If you haven't guessed either, she is my favourite of the Ireland pro tags. Totori is such a great lead, and though she doesn't really change much by the end, I'd say she doesn't really have to. The way she interacts with the world is what makes her so endearing. I've got a lot of time for Atelier Totori, which is saying something because it evidently didn't have much time for me. I'll be looking on this one fondly for years. We're breaking into the top 3 now, and also 9 out of 10 territory at least. Number 3 is going to go to Atelier Ryza 2, which as you may have deduced by now, is my favourite of the Ryza trilogy, and by quite a distance. In my opinion, Atelier Ryza 2 improves on nearly every aspect of the original, which was already a great starting point anyway. It takes place a few years after the first game, where Tao, who is now a student of the academy in the capital, has invited Ryza to investigate some mysterious occurrences. It eventually evolves into some shenanigans involving the secrets of the world and all that jazz. I know some people had an issue with this story, but I didn't. I thought it was fairly decent, all said and done. Not amazing, but I still remember quite a few moments within it, which is the marker of a decent story to me. If I remember its developments fondly, then that's enough for me to deem it adequate. I also think the characters really come into their own in this game. They're just given way more characterization with these distinct stories specific to each of them, and it's presented much better too. Same can be said of the alchemy. It's mostly the same, but there are a few tweaks here and there to freshen up the formula, along with straight up brand new mechanics to get introduced later on, like the ability to change material loop elements, or combining usable items to make something new. Elements like recipe morphing are still there, which increase your plethora of possible creations even further, but there are also additions like the skill tree, from which some items and gathering tools can only be unlocked through this, again making you feel that sense of progression. Combat as well, they went full on anime with this, and I loved it. I'm happy they carried it over to the final game too. At its core, it's mostly the same, an ATB approach, but it's more about the combos and the fast-paced action. It starts quite slow, but by the end you'll be doing DBZ shit for fun. Very cool. Add on all the other quality of life features for the likes of gathering and additions to exploration too, and the second Riser game just does everything a sequel should do. In fact, it was that much better than the original that I think it set the bar too high for the final game. Very well done, awesome entry and well deserving of a top 3 spot. At number 2, and this will most likely tell you what the top spot will be, is going to be the second Dusk game Atelier, Esker and Logi. The game takes place on the frontier lands in the village of Colsite, right near the boundary of the world and far away from the events of Ayesha. Logi arrives from the capital city to assist the local government's R&D department as an alchemist, where he soon finds out that he is working with another rookie alchemist in Esker. Both of them come together to help the village over the course of a few years by completing various assignments. What a joy! What an absolute joy this game is. While playing it, I just knew that this was what I looked for in an Atelier game. Esker and Logi does so many amazing things and excels in each one too. The first port of call, it has a dual protag feature and is the only one that has a male lead, and as a change, I decided to play as Logi for my main playthrough. His character story was a nice change of pace from the entries I've played previously. Esker's cut more from the same cloth of the standard protags of other games, but Logi has a bit more maturity and mystery about him. But what really allows the game to shine on the character side is that they work together so well. The way they assist and grow over the course of the game is really well handled. You get the impression they're an actual team throughout. I have to say as well that despite locking the true ending behind a playthrough of both characters, there's enough there to make a second playthrough worthwhile in terms of unique character endings and dialogue. Time limit? What time limit? It's there, but you'll barely even notice it. You get a main task, complete it in like 15 in-game days, and then you're free to do whatever you want for the last 80. Combat is great, 6 characters in total, 3 on the front, 3 on the back, and the use of support skills is awesome, plus items are just straight up busted in this game, as they should be, might I add. Making those items as well, so fun. The alchemy system in Esker and Logi is superb. It is the best iteration of the Dusk games and in the same bracket as Lydian Suel's. Having elemental points linked to your alchemy skills is just such a better way of going about it. It's all there at a glance, no hassle, no frustration, just a multitude of ways to engage with the system. This is the kind of alchemy system I crave. And then finally, the setting itself. Colsite being on the frontier lands of the Dusk games is basically at the edge of the world, and you start to realise the threat of the Dusk itself, this undeniable truth that the world is slowly dying. It's conveyed really well, and I'm just not used to seeing these games go down a more serious angle like this, but I definitely welcome more of it. Esker and Logi is very close to Atelier perfection for me. It's so good, and only lost out on the top spot because the final game is what I consider to be Atelier perfection. And that game at number 1, and what I consider to be the best modern Atelier game of the bunch, is Atelier Sophie 2. It was never in doubt for me. When I thought of putting this list together, Sophie 2 was straight in at the peak, as if the spot was reserved for it. Atelier Sophie 2 is one of my favourite games of all time, a 10 out of 10 JRPG, and it is pretty much flawless outside of a small hiccup here and there that does very little to take away from the overall package. All of the evolution of the series till this point has led to Atelier Sophie 2. This is the quintessential experience for me. Now, despite this being the 4th game in the series, Sophie 2 actually occurs before Atelier Firis, following on directly from the original Sophie. You don't need to play the first game to grasp onto this one, but you'll certainly get a few more nods and references if you have. But really, it was Sophie 2 where Gust really started to embrace the story of their games. The narrative is far more involved than many other titles in the franchise. It may not be perfect, but I was way more engaged in the narrative than in any other game. Exploration is fantastic with the weather changing mechanic. The combat with its turn-based switching archetype is just cool to work with, lots of secrets in the world, the OST is brilliant, the characters are on point, it's just brilliant in basically every area. And the alchemy system. It might take a little longer to get going than Lydian Sewell's, but there is no question for me that when it does fire on all cylinders, it is on par with that game, and dare I say it, might even surpass it in certain respects. The grid-based alchemy is superb. So fun to work with, lots of options to mix and match ingredients, catalysts to expand grid sizes, character abilities to push to ever higher effect levels. Man, I couldn't get enough of it. Sophie 2 will likely never be surpassed for me, no matter how many Atelier games I play. It is pretty much as flawless as it gets, and if any future or past title does surpass it, then fair play, it deserves it. All I know is that, for me, Atelier Sophie 2 is the best modern game to date, and I have no reservations in saying that to anyone. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe for more JRPG content, and consider joining my Patreon if you're interested. Peace.